how do we re-engage the public with the idea that what's happening in your local community is every bit as important as what's going on nationally, and in some ways more important because there's actually something you can do about it other than vote every 4 years.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. The following conversation is brought to you in part by the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, which supports our First Amendment and Free Press program, where we discuss journalism and the vital role that it plays in our democracy. Many thanks to the SPJ Foundation for its support. I'm here today with Dan Kennedy, a journalism professor at Northeastern University. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
So Dan, I invited you on today so we could discuss this legislative commission that was recently established in Massachusetts. The commission's going to study journalism, the need for it in our communities, and maybe provide some suggestions on how local newsrooms could be strengthened. But before we get to the commission specifically, I think it would be helpful for all of us if you could first describe the journalism landscape right now and how it's changed over recent years, so we can better understand why this commission was created in the first place.
Well, sure, absolutely. And I would begin with the closure of local newspapers around the country. And I don't mean to hold up newspapers as the only vessel that local journalism exists in, but it's still the most prevalent and the most efficient way of getting news out in the community. Over the last 15 or 20 years, according to the University of North Carolina, we've lost something like 2,200 local newspapers around the country. And many of the papers that are left are what the head of this project at UNC, Penelope Cruz Abernathy, refers to as ghost newspapers, and that is so little capacity left to do journalism that they might as well not exist. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Some of them are well known because we've been talking about them for years. The challenges posed by the internet versus print, the collapse of advertising, and the rise of Google and Facebook, which have gobbled up most of the revenue that are available for online advertising. And then the other part of this problem, which I don't think gets enough attention, although maybe people are starting to pay attention to it more these days, is the role of corporate chain ownership and hedge fund ownership, where you have these massive corporate entities swooping in and saying, you know, newspapers are still throwing off some revenues. Let's grab that, keep cutting, and when we have wrung out the last bit of blood, we'll just get out of here. So these are the problems that we face, and we need local journalism in order to get the news and information we need to govern ourselves in a democratic society. So as a result, a lot of people are thinking about a variety of different ways that we might revive local journalism. And this news commission that we're forming at the state level in Massachusetts is one of those ideas for at least trying to define the problem and maybe come up with some ideas for solving it.
Yeah, so clearly we're in a very challenging time for local journalists, those working on newspapers in particular. So let's talk about this commission. Now, this was a commission that was broadly supported by you and other faculty members at Northeastern, as well as others working in Massachusetts newsrooms. Tell us a little bit about the commission and how the idea of this commission began and what it's intended to do.
Well, I think the first conversations around this idea came up in late 2018. State Representative Lori Ehrlich and I were actually exchanging some emails, and she was talking about the lack of quality local coverage in her community. And I had in my mind the idea that New Jersey had just gone through a process of having some sort of a governmental study. And I said, gee, it would be interesting if we could do something like this in Massachusetts. And sure enough, she really took the idea and ran with it and put together a bill. It's been quite a long time in the making. I remember we had testimony on it on Beacon Hill in the summer of 2019. But then in December of 2020, it was revived. I guess it never really entirely went away, but the legislature tends to do all of its work at the last moment. And in late 2020, early 2021, the legislature approved it and Governor Baker signed it. And the members haven't even been named yet. I guess there were going to be 23 members when it's put together.
Yeah, I was taking a look at the language of the bill that was passed, the commission as it's going to be formed. There's a lot of voices in the mix here, a lot of stakeholders when it comes to journalism. What are some of your hopes for the commission? I mean, what do you expect to see out of this commission, whether it's in 6 months, a year, as it goes through, studying the state of journalism in Massachusetts and coming up with recommendations? What's the best case scenario?
Well, I guess we're going to move pretty rapidly. I understand that the commission has been asked to wrap up its work by August of this year. So that's quick work. And the way the legislation is written, I would be a member of the commission once they've pulled together all the nominees. But as one of just 23 people, I have some ideas, but I'm sure everybody's going to bring some ideas to the table. I think that one of the most important things that the commission can do is simply call attention to the good work being done in a number of communities that have independent local news sources of some type. People in those towns know about them, but often people outside of those towns have no idea. And if we could simply shine a light on some of those projects, maybe that would get people excited in other communities and say, we can do that in our community. There are nonprofit, almost nonprofit semi-volunteer models like the Bedford Citizen that I would love to see emulated elsewhere, especially in more urban and diverse communities. And there are, traditional newspapers like the Bay State Banner and the Dorchester Reporter that are covering their communities. Why can't other communities have something like that? I think in many ways they could, but people haven't really seen how that's working in places where news organizations are doing a good job. And I think a lot of it will be education in terms of letting people know that these projects are out there and you could do this in your city or town.
So these are all great things and great goals, but especially someone in my role leading a First Amendment organization, always looking for those, always looking for instances when government is infringing upon the press, always making sure that there's some separation there between government and newsrooms. So why have government involved in this way to establish a legislative commission as opposed to just getting all of these individuals, these 23 voices at the table informally to discuss these issues and come up with ideas on their own?
Well, you do that too. To date, it hasn't been done, but we have pulled together this governmental news commission. So let's see what we can do. Since it is a fairly short-term project, maybe once we wrap up our work, this can be essentially turned over to non-governmental groups that want to take the ball and run with it. I totally hear what you're saying about governmental interference, and there are various other levels that we could talk about where each kind of becomes more problematic, even though they are things that I think we probably need to at least discuss. I'll give you one example that people are talking about in terms of possible federal legislation. There's a bill in Washington that would give people the ability to write off the first $250 that they spend each year on subscriptions to news sites, newspapers, whatever. That's an interesting idea, and it doesn't really implicate the government in interfering with coverage in a way. There's also been talk of government advertising in local sources of news. And I was actually talking with a reporter just the other day about this. And he said, well, how do you make sure that the government isn't advertising in news outlets that favor them and then punishing those that are critical? It's a potential problem, isn't it? I think the way around that is that you have very strict criteria, and if you qualify, and there's no way of freezing you out. I'll take the leap and go to the most radical idea. I shouldn't use the word radical, but I just used it. In New Jersey, the study that they had there led to the formation of something called the New Jersey News Commons. And this is actually an organization funded by the government that you can apply for grants to carry out certain local reporting projects in your community. And that is direct funding of journalism. And you and I both know the problems that that can lead to. But what they've tried to do there is insulate it from politics by having an independent board administering this program. It's fairly new. It wasn't funded for a couple of years after the legislation was actually passed. So I think it's too early to tell how that's going to work. It's something that our commission might consider. On the other hand, maybe most of the people on the commission would think that's a non-starter.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, the Massachusetts Commission, its goal is to come up with some recommendations, some ideas, possible solutions, not to, at the end of this study, enact any specific programming, but to just provide those recommendations for the public to mull over and for legislators to possibly consider. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. We're not in a position to pass legislation or anything like that. It would strictly be recommendations.
So as you and the others on this commission soon go forth and begin studying these issues and discussing possible solutions, how can members of the public help? What kind of input would be most valuable to you and others on the commission as you're studying these issues and ultimately come up with recommendations that may be acted on?
You know, that's a great question. And I imagine we're going to have hearings, I would guess. And I was thinking about what we would want to hear from the public. Now, the commission itself only has a certain number of people on it who are journalists or who are academics who used to work in journalism. So I certainly think that we would want to hear from a number of people working in journalism who can tell us what the challenges are and what they need. We do have that expertise on the commission, but I'm sure we'd like to hear it from the larger community as well. What can members of the public tell us? You know, I'm not entirely sure, except that I would love to hear from members of the public about good local news projects in their communities that might be, you know, small one-person shops that we don't even necessarily know about. We'd love to hear about those things. If there was a way of articulating what the lack of quality news has meant in their community, that would be worth hearing about. Or the flip side of that, how things are so much better since a particular news project came online and started providing the coverage that they hadn't had before. I think that one of the challenges that we're going to face is that, as you know, the public is actually more engaged with news than they've been in many years. But that's been tied up in the nationalization of the culture, so that people have been intensely interested with what was going on with the Trump presidency and now the Biden administration. And so national media are doing better than they've done in a number of years. So how do we re-engage the public with the idea that what's happening in your local community is every bit as important as what's going on nationally, and in some ways more important, because there's actually something you can do about it other than vote every 4 years.
Many thanks, Ned, for explaining this commission, what it's all about, and giving us a better understanding of the issues here and the challenges facing local journalists.
Well, thanks for having me on and giving me a chance to talk about these issues, Justin. I really appreciate it.